So my name is Juan Carlos Valle, and my mother's name is Lopez. So in my motherland, where I came from, Mexico City, we use Valle Lopez to honor my mother, and I use Juan Carlos Valle here. And was born in Mexico City, one of 10 children. My mother had her first child at age 14. She herself was kind of like a farm girl, ranch. Grew up in a very small town, and it was not unusual for her peers to have kids at 13, 14. So I lived most of my life, well, a good part of my life in Mexico City until I was about 12, 13. Then I began the trek to up north to the US. Ended up working in the fields as a migrant worker with no skills, no abilities. But many good souls that had a lot of experience were willing to teach me and a friend whom I came with across the border. And eventually we started working up and down California, Oregon, Washington, doing strawberries in California and cherries and peaches in Oregon and apples and planting trees up in Washington. So I'll go back and forth to Mexico following the seasons. And then around 85, 86, I just stayed here. Didn't go back. That's when my journey began in the US.
And what do you do here in Eugene today?
So after spending quite a bit of time in Redding, California, there was a program for migrant workers to finish high school. It was called the High School Equivalency Program, or HEP. It was a program by the Department of Ed at the University of Oregon, and so they will help you to get your GED, and then from that, whatever. So I came to Eugene in the hopes of finish up my degree and I get my GED, which I got. It was wonderful for the first time to not to worry about food and shelter. I was in the dorms and I had food. They even gave me a stipend, I think, $10 or $15 a week or something. So it was really good to not to worry about working and sending money home for a few weeks. But then the program ended, and so I ended up being homeless here in Eugene again. I was actually homeless in Mexico City when I was a kid. And so eventually I made my way to LCC with the help of a nonprofit organization here called Centro Latinoamericano. At that point, actually, it was called Chicano Affairs. And so I identify myself as a Chicano, Mexicano, Latino. And so Chicano Affairs Center literally sent some volunteers to pick me up from under the bridge. And at first I was like, there's two white men talking to me in Spanish. I was like, what do you want? I thought they were trying to take my cans of food, because that usually happens. You go to sleep under the bridge and you wake up and your food is gone. And so, but no, they actually were recruiting me to go to Centro Latino and instead of one of the shelters for men. There was some veterans and some single men. And so they actually took me to do a job interview with Pizza Hut. And then they took me to LCC to sign up for classes to learn English. And then after a few things like that, I worked for the Hilton, I worked for LCC, and I was doing temporary jobs with the local government. And eventually I made my way into regular classes for LCC, then the U of O, and then I ended up with a postgraduate degree. So that's how I ended up in Eugene. And now I've been out there giving some my time and efforts back to the community through LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens. But that was founded in 1929. And so I was lucky and privileged to bring LULAC once again to Oregon to establish a council back in 2013. And the idea was to start a few councils here. As you know, there's many civil rights issues and civil rights violations in general, but more specifically against Latinos and people of color. And so the goal is to bring about 10 councils in the state of Oregon, so we can have a seat at the table in the national board Right now we have now 4 councils: Portland, Hillsborough, Medford, and Eugene, or Lynn County. And so that's my work. That's what how I identified as giving back to my community. My bills is paid by my public service and public government, but that's not who I am. Who I am is the person that is this community has raised.
And how, if you would like to speak personally, how you're treated as a member of the Latino or kind of community here in Eugene, like your day-to-day, the citizens of Eugene, your experiences here. If you want to share some of that, that would be great.
You know, it seems to me that either we are told or we understand, we BIPOC or people of color, we understand or we're tasked by the invisible energies that we have to educate people every day. So the minute I leave my house, then I have to take on that role. It's rarely that I get to sit back and not do that. But I think it's a joint effort. So as a person of color, your voice is that you have to help people understand the journey, maybe the journey of others. But sometimes it gets tiring because then you feel like the only one. Although lately, because of this movements, it seemed like I can take a step back and then actually have my own personal voice to be presented. Whereas in the last 25 years, it's been advocate for this group and that group. And this movement, not only with Mr. Floyd and what happened, but many others before, that really things are really coming to the forefront for the general population. But for us, it's always been there. We see it every day. And now it's just kind of being pushed to the front burner. And I don't know where we're going to go there. But it seems like the education piece never ends. This community has kind of raised me in a way, from picking me up from the streets to sending me to school, and ended up in postgraduate school. And I have a pretty decent job that allows me to resolve my payments and things like that for my family. I'm able to be in a better situation than I was back in the early 90s when I was homeless. But it also seems that there's that glass ceiling, and that this community being progressive, liberal, once you get into different circles, then you're actually face to face with racism and the status quo. And in the process, I mean, I have had many angels, many people that have taken interest in my development. They have told me, did you know about this? Did you know about this opportunity? And I can name many of them, whether it was my supervisor at the city of Eugene, or at the health when I was working there, or many other places where people of color, it's not that we don't want the opportunities or we don't seek the opportunities, we just don't know that the opportunities exist. So they really take somebody to ask you, did you know about this? Did you know about that? That's called institutional knowledge that we, people of color, most likely don't have. For example, in the general population, it's likely you're going to find somebody at your house, either your parents, that have at least a high school education, and sometimes maybe some college or college. In the people of color houses, you may have mixed or maybe no education, especially now with increasingly larger immigrant population. They may not have as much education at home, although there's also changing. There's many folks coming to our state, into the country with quite a bit of education. In the process, I've met a lot of great people that have helped me get a better quality of life. But I also met some people that, on the outside, they say they're progressives and liberals, but their actions do not show. And it's more specifics when you are into boards and commissions, or when you get into politics, and then you get into programming, and actually areas where We're trying to showcase the entire community, not just some segments of the community. That's when it gets political and tricky, because sometimes unconscious bias takes place. Now remember, Eugene and Portland were two places where the KKK was flourishing. Oregon itself, the state of Oregon, our state, in fact, was not allowing for black folks and even Asians to own property. So it's not that long ago. And so, I mean, remember the Sunset Laws. Looking at our history in Eugene, for example, if you go out 24, 25, where the city limits were, that's where the areas where black people were allowed to be, and out, Churchill area. And this is not that long ago, where this history. So all of this movement is really kind of pushing those conversations forward, but I know it's kind of uncomfortable for many folks. For us, that's the conversation we are forced to have every day. But I'm pleased that now more voices, not just mine, are speaking up and kind of more willing to present their perspectives that helps people of color understand. But also, it seems to me that what's changing is now we're kind of getting the place in this space of place and time for us to use our own voices. Whereas before, there were others that were trying to tell my story, hence what you were telling earlier. So that's changing too, and I'm glad, because several people out in the community have been telling my story, and they mean well. They have a good heart, but they don't check in with me to ask me if that's true. And they've done that because they're the ones who actually have access to places where they make decisions and programming and all that. So understand that. But not having that kind of back and forth, hasn't been good. If you ask me if the Eugene is open, if we define open, for me, they're not open. But in their definition to where they've been, but they've been closed for many years, then yeah, it's open. But to me, I was like, if you ask the pillars of our community, especially the African American folks and some of the first generation Latinos here, they all say, no, we're not there yet. And two things have to happen. One is that we, people of color, have to get used to seeing each other in positions of influence and authority, and the dominant culture to be more comfortable working with me side by side, in that we all are at the table, making decisions, not just for the community, but for the next generations. So I think we're getting more comfortable talking about it, but we're not yet comfortable having people of color be the ones leading. That's going to take much longer time and many more conversations. But it is going to require really that we are more visible and that spaces are open for that to happen. And then more collaboration projects and things that we do as community needs to happen, because that's when I have found that I get to learn more about my community and they get to learn about me. For example, when I was in Rotary, some of my peers were saying, well, I guess, no, you don't sell drugs. Well, I guess President Trump is wrong. You're not a rapist. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm glad you noticed that. But working side by side with folks, they'll say, oh, well, you're family oriented too. Oh, wow, you love your community also. But without each other giving that opportunity to work side by side, then when issues and preconceived ideas or unconscious bias arise, and they will continue to arise, then we don't have any place to go back and fall to. When folks learn and we are open to work with each other, then we're likely to be the ones saying, you know what, that's probably your experience, but this is what we know about our community. And the more we're comfortable with the community, I think we're going to be more comfortable letting each other make decisions. And that seems to be more reflected and more so at the higher levels where they're making decisions, like in the city council, county commissioners, even the school boards. That's what I think ultimately will be one of the many signs that we might be more comfortable making changes.
So speaking of making decisions, what does voting mean to you?
Well, voting has always been crucial. This is our voices, I will say this is my duty. I don't know if everybody else sees that way, this is my duty. But where I'm coming from, I came to this country without documents. I earned my citizenship. And part of that was, this is part of your duty, to vote, to get informed. So people will say, this is very crucial to vote, and it is. It is, because as you vote, you need to have your voice count. But it's more than that. I think it's more about understanding that this is your community, and that one of the ways you actually showcase that you care about your community is through voting, exercising that right. Other countries, in fact, citizens are dying for the right to vote. It was not that long ago that women were allowed to vote, or African Americans, and I can go on and on. So voting is that, but it also has to come with education, peer-to-peer, making it easier to vote. I know in Oregon we're lucky that we can vote by mail. Right now in other parts of the country, they're making it more difficult to vote. Voter suppression, it's no secret. And it seems to happen quite a bit more in people of color communities, based on the requirements that they're asked to produce. But by all means, even though in Oregon we vote by mail, and I've taken my own tradition to actually get my ballot and get it filled, and actually go to Pearl and 8th, and I just go in there. That's my way to, you know what, I did my duty, here it is. And that's just my own ritual, right? I go, this is it, it's maybe one of thousands of votes, but to me, it counts. Until I see a national holiday to vote, even if it is by mail, then I don't think that we're really doing everything we can. So again, it seems to me that in the last several years, it's been more difficult for people of color to actually vote. And with places where like Oregon in California, where you can mail in your vote, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's easier for people of color, because then you get into barriers about education, whether or not they know about the candidates. You get into issues about taking us for granted, which usually happens, and more so with specific party. So again, just because in Oregon it's easier for us to vote, it doesn't mean that we're actually participating, right? In Oregon, the Latino population is about 13.3%. And of those, I don't know how many are citizens and able to vote. But it'll be good to kind of look into people of color population. And of those eligible to vote, are we investing in them to be able to vote? And I'm not one to say, vote this way for this party. That's up to them. But I think as a society, we have to kind of increase the civic education in terms of helping them understand who even represent us. Like I myself, I talked to some of the Latino families, and even some folks of color, and they don't know who the representative is. Do you know who your city councilor is? No. What's city council? You know who your mayor is? And they have no idea. But then I ask, well, what's the story? He said, well, I don't feel like I make a difference. I don't feel like I'm a part of the community. I'm not listened to. So again, not just making it easier to vote, but making it easier for people to understand and engage, and to see how our vote affects many things. Typically on an election, it's not just the candidates, but also ballots and decisions you need to make, like the library levy or the education levy and all those things that affects us directly, not only today, but tomorrow and for our children. So that's where I think as a community, we have to do much, much better.
Do you think that systematic change can be achieved through voting?
I believe so. Especially because if people understand that our vote counts and that our voices are taken serious, the elected officials will pay attention. The first thing they do is they look at all the precincts and they see how the vote landed, who's voting. Oh, after all, though, it seems to me that we need to help them understand that they work for us, that we are the ones that are, in some cases, paying the salary, like the county commissioners, or that we give them a stipend, like a city council, and they are also volunteers. But they are still there because they want to serve back our community. So I think a stronger reminder is important, but it has to come with the understanding of educating folks that this is their community and this is how they do. But systemic issues is across the board, whether it is, even though we vote by mail in Oregon, there are some areas in Eugene, for example, that maybe even voting is down at the bottom of the list. There's some outliers in our city, just to name a few, like West Eugene, Whitaker. There's some areas that we need to have more investment in more job security, food security, shelter. So sometimes voting is not going to be at the top of the list. I mean, when I was homeless, my priority was find food, find shelter.
Yeah.
Well, at the end of the day, to me, and this is where the part that I get kind of more rigid in a way. I have become a little more rigid, less flexible, in that if we are going to say we are a community and we care for everybody, that before we start talking about anything else, we have to fulfill that. Is it a promise? Well, then let's work on that. Let's work on taking care of our community, right? If we're talking about maybe it's a high dropout amongst Black students and Latino students, this is my children and your children. We have to take care of them. I think it'll be a while before we get to that point, but we have to aim for that, because that's for the betterment and the legacy for the next generation. I think that's important. That's super crucial for us to do that. I think that if we start thinking in those terms, to bring up the whole community and not just segments of the community, I think we will have the ability to then trust that the generations themselves are going to be a lot more self-sustained, because we are no longer going to say, here's the fish, you go eat, right? Because we've been doing that for a long time.
Yes.
Right? Now, I hope that we're going to say, here's a fishing pole, and I'm going to show you how to use it. We, like one of the teachers that I know, happens to be from Bolivia, very good teacher. She says, I'm doing it, I do, we do, and you do. She's showing her students how to do something, because again, that's when the institutional knowledge comes in. We don't know how to do it. You are the ones who have the experience, the access. You're showing me how to do it. Then we're doing it together. You're making sure that I'm doing it, that you're learning how to fish your own food. And then you step back. And then you let that person, the student, takes care of that, right? That sustainability, I think, is what we have to aim for. But it has to be in a way that is equitable. We have to then be willing to spread the resources.
Yep.
There. I want to know Eugene as a Eugene that takes care of the community, of its community, that takes care of its families or its children. I want to know a Eugene that is truly progressive in the word, that we're progressing to what we are. Again, remembering our roots, the state of Oregon roots itself, right? I mean, look what's happening in Portland. I am not surprised. And who initiated and who's doing terrible things, right? the history of Oregon. We have to, as embarrassing as that may be, we have to remember our past so that we learn and we know where we're going. But I think if we have all those elements to expand the institutional knowledge, I think we're going to have more families to be self-sustained and therefore leave a beautiful legacy. And that's why I'm out there too.
All right. I know we could have this conversation forever, but
So is there any one last thing that you want to share with the community? Just with the work that still needs to be done?
Yeah, it's important that we continue to encourage and to define allies, because that conversation is not taking place. I think it's very important, because ultimately I am not the one making the decisions. It's somebody doing it for me. And now they're inviting me to be a part of it. And that's wonderful. These talks, these videos, it's one of the many beautiful venues. So I think that helping define what an ally means is going to help a lot of people out there. And checking in with me, what I need for my ally, and what that relationship looks like. To check in with me and ask me, what is it that I want? What is it that I need? Because there will be a point in which the roles will be reversed, that we need to be supportive of each other. So I think, and I'm not just saying the allies as in white folks, because allies is also across the board, right? I've learned that when I was working with Basic Rights Oregon. That was a beautiful lesson for me. But I think, helping to be allies, to become an ally, and no longer a bystander, that's one of the biggest changes we can make in this community. And in some cases, as somebody else mentions to me, to be an accomplice, to create change, right? Like my daughter, she's now in high school. She was looking out and saw this ugly air, toxic. She said, "You're working out there to try to improve this, right?" So, do my best. He says, "Hey, is there anything good that's going to be left for me?" And that really sunk by my stomach. And understanding that this is a part of a legacy that we're leaving for my daughter and her peers, that's going to be something very important for the community to understand fully.